Hello everyone, and welcome to the final video installment of our somewhat aborted semester, but which, thanks to you, we have heroically continued. I really appreciate all of you sending pieces of writing that I really enjoyed reading. I like the fact that you really stuck with it, and I hope you were able to benefit in some way. I hope you were able to live this period in a peaceful way that enables you to maybe discover a good book or two, or hopefully, right? Who knows? Even though it's probably not the best way to present what this period is, hopefully you were able to make the most of it at any rate. So this so this is sort of our last class. We can think of it being our last class because, as you're aware, next week we have a week's vacation. So you can do whatever you'd like with that. What I am thinking though is, and this is something I mentioned in an email, but I wasn't very precise about. I was thinking that if, for example, I was thinking of some way to organize maybe like a video conference, and that would have been really a little bit confusing. We never really could do the workshop that I was thinking we might be able to have. But what I would invite you to do is this will be a little bit more of a free form way to help you, I would say, kind of finish off the semester, and it's sort of an optional thing. What I'm going to offer is that for for anyone who would wish, I can give you sort of like, if we could have like a 15-minute individual video chat. I'm not sure how we could do this really. I'll have to figure out the best way to do it, because there are some platforms we could perhaps install. I have Skype. I think maybe Skype would be the best way. We could have sort of an individual Skype chat on me being able to give you feedback for what you've written, and if you have questions, we could perhaps talk on strategies for your final text. So that I'll leave that up to you. That you just send me an email, and we'll arrange a time, and we'll have a little 15-minute. Well, I mean, I say 15-minute. The idea is I don't want it to exceed 15 minutes. But it could be shorter. I mean, conceivably it could be longer, but it's a very brief sort of consultation session that I think is pretty valuable. That should really help you not feel abandoned, because it's we haven't really been able to see each other in class. So hopefully that'll help with your kind of putting everything together for your final writing projects. And so what does this mean? I don't have a schedule. I probably should have taken my schedule out here, or do I have it out here? I do not. This is our last. Well, we could say this is our last week of formal class. Last week, and so in 2 weeks, I will ask you to hand in everything you are to hand in. Let me look and see the exact dates. Whoops, that's not the right document. I'm sorry about this. There it is. I'm sorry. So today is April. We're on week 11. We are on April 10th. Yeah, this is April 10th. Next week we do not have class, and then they're following. Week 12, final week, is the week of the 20th of April, and that means the 24th will be when I will ask you to hand in your writing assignments. And I say writing assignments because the 24th of April, let's say by midnight. Just in case you're wondering, but sorry, I have to make sure that we are good. Excuse me. So I say writing assignments because as we said from the outset, you can write whatever you'd like, right? It's sort of an open. Try to keep this as open as we can. So now with our final session, I'd like to, as you might have sort of understood, we kind of went off on this lengthy discussion of poetry, and I tried to do that to really make you understand sort of what's specific to writing prose. That's the word we use for it. That's usually the preferred medium. Prose is basically sort of everyday English is one way to describe it. To really understand sort of, the way you write, what you can accomplish sort of with writing style and that kind of thing. And if you remember, so I sort of presented a certain history. It's sort of, in every history has its biases. So I kind of presented a history in a sense that makes fiction out to be their hero. I talked about, Mikhail Bakhtin's theory and his aesthetics of the novel, and when he says that, in the 19th century, fiction really becomes the, more socially relevant mode of expression than poetry. And we talked about that with relationship to the voice, right? The fact that we have, a narrator, there's a certain openness in this narrator's voice. The narrator's voice is not inclusive. It is not sort of limited to an association with the writer or the narrator, if you prefer, but it can take on, inflections of other voices. So it's a little bit more extensive, right? And that makes it, a very a really, effective vehicle for sort of enacting all the sort of, basically we talk about social conflicts. Different voices sort of correspond with, different ways of speaking that are related, that are a part of, come from different social groups. So this is sort of this, the idea is that the narrator's voice is sort of an arena, or sort of that or sort of like a big chorus of, dissonant voices that come from different social backgrounds, right? So that makes it be a very, an excellent vehicle in the we're talking about sort of the 19th century novel, as a sort of expression of society, right? So that we talked about that, and of course that's perhaps unfair to fiction. It's a little bit, that means that saying that poetry doesn't do this, or is a little bit unfair. It's a little bit of a biased story, but but there is some truth to be said that 19th century. I've talked a lot about 19th century novels. The novel kind of takes over culturally in the 19th century, at least according to Bakhtin. And I'm not going to say if I agree or not. Who knows, right? But it's an interesting way to sort of understand this question of sort of relevance. We get the feeling that, in the 19th century, the novel is just, as relevant as anything, right? And so today, what I'd like to talk about, this question of sort of popular culture, because what we're saying is sort of in the 19th century, the novel becomes kind of more popular, right? It's more of it was serialized, right? It was produced sort of like soap operas, right? If you read like War and Peace, you feel like you're really reading the way it's done, and in these the great novels of the 19th century are sort of written in this serialized way. We really feel like they're an expression of sort of popular culture. Although there's many more things we could say about that needs to be sort of qualified, but let's leave it at that. And we can say that this, yes, of course, continues into the 20th century, and then there's sort of modifications. I talked about sort of modernism, and sort of the fact that that involves sort of an implosion of I would say the novel, with works such as Joyce's Ulysses. We do get the feeling that the novel is being asked to do more, right? It's a pretty artsy thing, right? Okay, and it that can sort of lead to some kind of dislocation of the novel being sort of the sort of privileged vehicle for popular expression, and yeah, that doesn't mean that it doesn't continue to be so really throughout the 20th century, but there's sort of the new problem is sort of that we're thinking of this idea of most effective way to express things going on in society, right? Of course we talked about the fact that the movies take over, and all the TV shows and things like that, and that's something really that, in a sense, as a fiction writer, you kind of have to contend with, in a sense. I say you have to contend with it. You can think of there being strategies. One strategy is to say, no, forget it, I'm going to make movies instead, right? There's a lot of movie makers, right? Or people who create TV shows who choose other, another medium because they feel as if they are, I would say, more effective, or they sort of more alive to the more appropriate medium, and they're more alive to sort of expressing popular concerns, right? Things that are sort of more relevant to society. And it in the novel, in fiction writing, is sort of in danger of becoming sort of this boutique, specialized, sort of effete, sort of, in a sense, marginal, in the sense that it's associated with a sort of a select literary involvement, which means sociologically that we're talking about, usually sort of, I want to, let's say, upper middle class, really well educated types. It becomes sort of, I'm not saying the novel was never sort of specific to that group, but it can seem, right, and there is some argument to the statement that the novel becomes sort of more, relegated to sort of an elite sphere, and as such, not really relevant to sort of everyday popular concerns, right? And that actually becomes sort of a preoccupation to a lot of people who write fiction are kind of aware of this, right? And what's good is you can adopt strategies. I think one way to think about is to think of the fact that the novel is in kind of competition with other things. And there's sort of two ways you can go about it. You can kind of dig your head in the sand, right, and pretend that movies don't exist, and you can sort of exist in and I sound like I'm being very critical of this. It's a possibility. There are great novels that are written sort of that are very much sort of literary. I'm thinking of something like A.S. Byatt's Possession, which is sort of it's a fairly recent novel written by a British writer. It's a historical novel written about university researcher studying a Victorian poet, and we really feel we do, and we really feel like we are kind of plunged into this 19th century world. We kind of, and it's amazing. It's a great novel. And it's actually, ironically, a real reflection on, because it's sort of a critique, this novel, of the current state of affairs in universities, using even things like technology. So there is sort of one approach that you can become sort of kind of plunged in this sort of, I would say, sort of a cut off universe, right, in which people live for books and the internet doesn't exist and things like that. And that's one approach, and I'm not going to say if that's good or bad, right? Another approach would be one to sort of, in a sense, to sort of compete with popular culture, and think of someone like Balzac, who says, and I think really what makes Balzac's novels relevant is probably one of his most well-known quotations, where he says, he said, "Je veux faire concurrence à l'état civil." Donc he's sort of, the idea is there's this, that you feel like you really want to compete with the sort of leading forms, if you prefer. So, and by the way, there I've included, I'm not going to talk about them here. If you want to read sort of people who've reflected on this, we have the French literary critic Roland Barthes. We have Walter Benjamin. There's a really good book on this. I'm talking in this attached document. You can see these references. We have the work of Art in the Age of Mechanical Production. Really interesting reflection about this kind of thing. And I would say, really, Marshall McLuhan. He's a really interesting mixture of a literary critic and a media and a philosopher and a media critic. And anything you read by him is really, he's really good at this idea, being aware of, and he's really unearthed a lot of things that people never thought about. The fact, for example, Mallarmé, it's really important that he worked as a journalist for a fashion review, right? And the fact that he wrote this sort of expendable journalism, right, in a sort of age where these reviews are kind of produced in a mechanical way, much quicker, right, than they used to be, and they're kind of mass produced, right? That is sort of the counterpoint to his writing, his very effete, arcane symbolist poetry, right? So that's, if you're interested in this question, I would say read that, if you feel like it. And I'll try to talk about, and I've given lists of other writers and the strategies they developed to deal with this. And so one way that this is done, and this is kind of similar, one approach sort of facing this challenge, right? And it's a sense we could say that this sort of means that I think that this sort of calls into question the legitimacy of writing fiction, right? Fiction really is only as legitimate as it is relevant, right? And so if there was a time when writing fiction was sort of much more relevant to, you know, a wider percentage of the population, right? That is really what makes it legitimate, right? And so if you remember when we looked at sort of the birth of the novel, right? Remember we said that, but this is sort of before the 19th century. In the 18th century, the novel is a less legitimate, you know, art form, right? So it uses kind of borrowed techniques, and I wrote this in the document you're going to find. I wrote displaced medium fiction, and it's interesting to see that sort of in this day and age we kind of go back to this. Because of there's sort of a legitimacy crisis, if you will, for the novel, we sort of a lot of sort of modern, you know, people will say postmodern. I'm not going to get into the question of postmodern fiction or not, but a lot of more contemporary writers are going to for example, use sort of a displaced vehicle. Now, what am I talking about? Helen Fielding and the Bridget Jones Diary, which is I would say much more interesting novel than a lot of people like to think. People kind of like to discount it as some sort of, you know, some writers call it chick lit, you know, just like a woman's light fiction, but it's a much it's a heck of a lot better than that. But I think people fall in the trap. People just it's actually so effective that people don't really realize how profound it actually is. It's a diary, right? The form it's actually very refreshing when you read the first page of the book. You're reading it. It's a diary about this woman who says she's trying not to eat a lot of potato chips because she has calories, and you know and so you realize that this is actually a novel, right? Well, that's what's interesting about the novel. I'm trying to sort of make you aware of this. The novel is sort of it's really not supposed to be fixed, right? You can kind of take anything and make it into a novel, right? And so if you kind of want the novel not to be dead, you kind of has to eat something, right? A novel is kind of like this big monster that sort of inhales other art forms, right? And so, you know, Helen Fielding in her Bridget Jones Diary, she writes, it's sort of a pastiche of a diary. It's not a real, of course, it's a fictive diary, right? And it's very convincing because it is really the diary that this working woman who's kind of struggling with a lot of things, with going home to vacation and family, and with her boss, and a lot of and there's obviously melodrama in it, and it becomes sort of, I would say, more relevant because it uses a borrowed medium, right? Because just writing sort of third person traditional narrative fiction, as like Balzac would. It can seem kind of stale. So that's something you might want to be aware of. You might want to write like a fake journal, right? Okay. Another idea, even though this isn't really relevant to fiction, but this is a similar kind of a technique or a strategy, is there's a historian. His name is Ian Mortimer. And he, I'm going to correct this. I spelled this incorrectly in your document. He writes that he has a history book for the Middle Ages. Actually the end of the Middle Ages in the 14th century, and it's interesting. He writes it like a travel guide, like, as if it's a time-out guide to Amsterdam or something like that, right? So it says, you walk into town, you'll notice this and that, and you notice that these are the kind of strategies that a lot of sort of modern writers develop these kind of strategies. Well, I'm going to make a fake, travel guide. And you can make that into a fictional account, right? Or you could do like another strategy is really this in Helen Fielding, she kind of works along these lines, is you can do sort of a fake like self-help book, right? How to be a popular teenager or something like that, right? And the idea is you can kind of let yourself go, right? You can the idea is once again, we're in this sort of university fiction writing course, so I'm trying to say you should write correct English, and you should take care of your prose style. But ironically, your style can kind of take care of itself, right? If you kind of let yourself go and try something that you that doesn't it might not even really seem serious to do that kind of a thing, right? To really say, wait a second, I can't hand in a story that's just sort of a sort of a pastiche. Here we talk about this question of like satire and pastiche. That's a pastiche of a I don't know, a travel writing guide or a journal. I should say diary. That's sort of more accurate. Or like a self-help book, right? But you can, right? I mean, you can try something like this if you'd like, if you feel like it would be fresher, right? So that's sort of a reminder that, you know, fiction writing, and I'm talking really about the novel. You're not writing a novel, but the same holds true for short story writing, is very effective. It's a loose form, right? Okay, and it's usually most alive when it kind of absorbs other forms, right? So allow yourself to absorb something else. And we did talk about this when we looked at the story about the woman. We look at the woman who calls up. Remember, we looked at that in detail. Who calls up her, tries to call her son, and she gets her daughter-in-law, and we could say once again it's a displacement. So keep that in mind for strategy. Now, another thing that is often true of these of sort of writers who are sort of aware of, I would say, the difficulty of, I would say, the, you know, decreasing relevance of writing fiction today, right? You know, these are people who are very aware that, you know, people spend a lot more time zoning around on the internet than around in fiction, and the fact that, you know, text messages are sort of a bigger part of your life than, you know, reading, you know, long books. So the people, there's a lot of writers who really are, I would say, they incorporate these elements into they try to sort of incorporate these elements to the book. So try to think about, really use text messages. This should really make, I would say, you know, text messages, you know, excerpts from the internet, these kind of things, all these sort of modern media things. You can once again, you can swallow them up, right? You can inhale them, right? And there's a lot of writers who modern writers who use this strategy, and sometimes it involves sort of, I would say, it's not as much what we might call a preoccupation with the medium itself, right? Whether it be like the internet or, you know, text messages or this kind of thing, right? Things related to, you know, technology and communications. But it can also be this idea of popular culture, because these two things go hand in hand, right? When we have, you know, TV, and when we have, you know, radio, TV, and then we have, you know, mass communication, we have the birth of, you know, this sort of popular culture. We have different, you know, famous people, you have stars and this kind of business, and that is something that, and usually that's sort of the realm of TV, right? That's sort of the realm. Stars, right? Famous people are really most commonly represented in, you know, TV and movies and so on, right? And so there are a lot of writers who use actually fiction to do this, and this usually involves, I would say, almost a disruption of the fictive technique, right? And I just want to give, there's a lot of lists about this. Some of these are more historical. I think the first few I gave you are historical. We have a writer, Michael Chabon. He looks like the name sounds like he might be French, but he's American. I mean, he has The Amazing Adventures of Cavalier and Clay, and these are about sort of two. It's a really interesting story about sort of New York in this sort of, you know, reacting to you know, Jewish immigrants living in New York, reacting to, you know, totalitarianism, and writing comic books and creating this sort of adventure series, and that the idea is that that's sort of a new form, right? And it's interesting that it's a novel about that, right? Okay. I would say similar things could be said for some of the novels of Don DeLillo. We have Underworld and White Noise. Underworld is a really good. There's a lot of famous people from American culture in the 50s in there, right? And you know, you're going to see, you know, famous gangsters, Jackie Robinson, a lot of and these are the ideas. It's really interesting. There's something kind of photographic in his writing style. Is really, you know, the dialogue is really crisp, and we get the feeling that the dialogue is kind of influenced by, you know, TV and radio, and his writing style is too. I would say the Underworld might be that's a big undertaking. You know, that's sort of a compendium of 50s culture in some way. And you also might want to look at, you know, James Ellroy, really famous writer who also works very much in this vein. And this time it's more to do with what we call in French, sort of like le fait divers, right? And very often this also has to do with approaching sort of really sensational, often very violent topics. And that the James Ellroy, that's what he's known for. And it's actually, Stendhal did this with like Le Rouge et le Noir, right? He started from this, as they call it, like le fait divers. And there is this idea that like the newspaper clipping, right? Okay, is sort of reappropriated, right, in fiction. And so if you read like James Ellroy, The Black Dahlia is about sensational violent murder. I'm not gonna, but there is this, very often we have this sort of preoccupation with violence and sensationalism. And I would probably, people read this less, but she's a very impressive. I would say she's sort of the most impressive woman of, as they used to say, woman of letters living today would be sort of Joyce Carol Oates, and she has I mentioned her sort of in the same breath because she kind of rewrites these sort of I would say the violent TV series, right? Except she's there's something extremely strange because she at the same time is sort of one of the more kind of well-read literary figures, and she has a novel on, for example, Marilyn Monroe. It's called Blonde. We could go farther and farther. I think I don't want to get you too weighed down with this. I don't want to go through every book on my list. I could kind of go through more in detail, but I'll just give you a reminder. I think you get this idea, and the idea is it's sort of more of an appeal to, more an appeal of your ability to sort of be advantaged and take a chance, and instead of the paradox, instead of being too worried about the fact that writing fiction is difficult. Yeah, it's really hard to do, right? But strangely, sometimes you can just make it easier, right? By saying, well, actually, writing, imitating, I don't know, the story, imitating cheap Harlequin romance, that could actually work, So the idea is you can you don't have to, right? I'm not saying that you shouldn't write traditional fiction, but you might, one way to sort of get over the difficulty of writing fiction is to just be aware of the fact that it is a very supple form and it can adopt any other form, really any one, right? And I really probably should have given more examples of this, right? I should have, and I think really the sky's the limit. Actually, in a sense, I shouldn't, because you can, there's a lot of stuff I haven't mentioned, and you might sort of come up with an idea that is your own that says, ooh, this sort of thing has not been imitated yet. That's a new idea, and that'll make it fresher, right? That's really what adds to the freshness of a lot of fiction. So that's pretty much it. I could go through with maybe just suggestions. For example, we have Jeffrey Eugenides' The Virgin Suicides, which was made into. It's interesting that this was made into a movie, and it's has a lot to do with, once again, this idea of sensationalism, violence, and it's also this fact that in today we're very much treating this question of it's sort of this idea of voyeurism, right? And the fact that we have sort of this male limited perspective that tries to get into the secret female perspective, and that's actually a real big reflection on what can fiction tell us. We need to sort of it's a way to get around the sort of limits of traditional fiction. Something else also, as far that scenes I want to maybe get away a little bit from fiction. I don't think I've mentioned her, but the famous feminist from the 60s, 70s, Gloria Steinem. She writes. She has a really interesting autobiography called My Life on the Road. And once again, it's sort of we get the feeling that she's sort of a public figure, right? And it's there. It's that's another element that I wanted to sort of reflect about. We talked about the fact that these things, this idea of mixture of sort of the mass media and then sort of intimacy, right? And you might want to reflect a little bit about that if you're interested, let's say, in writing about someone sort of famous, someone that there are characters that we only see sort of on the screen or in TV, and it creates an unusual effect that when you encounter them in fiction, right? And Gloria Steinem herself, she's famous. She's one of the leading, most famous feminists from the 60s and 70s, and she treats that in I would say a very reflexive way. When we have this sort of mixture of sort of the intimate and the public, right? And that is also a part of this, this whole idea of, I would say, like the paradox of popular fiction. So you might be interested in that too, okay? And maybe also, we're talking about sort of the pop novel. You might be interested in reading something by Bret Easton Ellis. I never really know what to think about him. I had a conversation about him the other day with someone who likes him a lot. I don't think I really like him because he's sort of a spoiled rich kid for me. But his first novel, Less Than Zero. I mean, it's just to sort of show you about sort of how you can use popular culture. There are no literary references in Bret Easton Ellis's Less Than Zero, right? But there are tons of musical references to. And it's about, by the way, this sort of a disconnected period of the son of a Hollywood movie producer, and there's a lot. It's all sort of behind there. Sting once makes it. There are sort of famous people that make appearances there, and it's also a part of sort of a lot of underground music. For example, the title, not more or less underground, but Less Than Zero. The title itself, right, is the title of an Elvis Costello song, right? So and that's one thing you can use is you can kind of turn your references around, right? You can sort of make all your references popular, right? And that actually, once again, that might kind of brighten up your fiction. And sort of lastly, we haven't really talked about any English stuff, and especially writers that are sort of outsiders because their parents are not from the country where the writers have been born. There's a really interesting writer, Hanif Kureishi, who I think people kind of give him unfair treatment. I think he, I don't know, probably isn't taken as seriously as he should be because he has kind of outlandish titles. For example, he wrote the screenplay of a miniseries called Sammy and Rosie Get Laid, right? So people might, just like, Helen Fielding, people might not take him very seriously, but I welcome you to do so. For example, The Boot of Suburbia, it's definitely one of the I don't know, it's the more prevalent, or more prevalent's a bad word. Let's say relevant again. Let's say it's one of the more relevant pop novels. And it's interesting because it is the story. It's very autobiographical. Hanif Kureishi is the son of immigrants from, some from India and some from Pakistan in his wider family, and he went to the same high school as David Bowie, and it's a reflection on, and it's very interesting because there's once again this idea of the popular novel where we are not limited. Obviously he's writing an English novel and he's very aware of that he's writing an English novel and he's read all the classics, and there's great passages about him, the character, I should say instead, the first person narrator who has discussions with his cousin, and they're staying up at night and reading all the great classics of English fiction, and then they kind of break out of that, and this has a lot to do with, they break out of that and they start becoming much more involved with popular culture, and ironically that allows them to say more about their own sort of foreignness, if that makes sense, than just remaining within sort of the canons of Western culture. That could have been explained a little bit better. That was a little bit quick at the end, because the idea is also to sort of maybe, if you find sort of any of those books that might interest you, you don't have to read them, of course. You don't have to read anything, but if you're kind of stuck, right, with your last idea for what you're writing, what I'm trying to say here is the difficulty. It might be healthy. The fact that you might be stuck might be a good sign. It might be because you maybe should just think that you might be a little bit too attuned to the where that fiction is sort of it can be a little bit of a limited medium today, and you might want to seek your inspiration elsewhere.